things that I've heard repeatedly from this group is, right, the importance of story and the importance of storyteller. And so the stories we tell are very important. One of the things I've also heard is that, right, we hear the environmental community talking about climate change and climate justice. Man, it's either really boring because it's graphs and charts and statistics, and we all know statistics never lie, but liars use statistics. So it's either graphs and charts, or it's all doom and gloom. It is all, the sky is constantly falling, and it's and people get tired of that, and people tune out to that. And I have had to stop talking about issues the way I talked about them and talk about them completely differently, because people don't want to hear it. There have been a couple important things that have helped me figure out some new ways to talk about things. There was a study, so you'll get this link. There was a study done by researchers in the journal Nature that looked at where people get their information from, and whether they accept that information, whether they will take in that information, absorb it, and use it to change their worldview, right? Which is what we're trying to be about, right? Changing people's worldview. And basically, and then in the grist, there was a sort of a summary of that. And they looked specifically at people who are climate skeptics, who do not believe in climate change. And how could it be that with all of the really good science and all of the available science, how could it possibly be that people could still not believe that climate change was true? Surely if we showed them one more graph of temperatures going up, that they would come to understand. No. What the researchers found, and they described this as this concept of motivated reasoning. And this is important. We begin as human beings absorbing the values of our tribes, what is and is not important, what is and is not a risk, and then use whatever data is available to us to support the values that we have absorbed from our tribes. And this is the key. Getting smarter, in other words, only makes us better at justifying our own worldview. The more data, the more charts and graphs I show to someone who's a climate skeptic, the more I'm convincing them to be skeptical of climate change. Because I'm making broad, sweeping generalizations here, because I'm not part of their tribe, right? I think this is really key. So, and I've been thinking about it in relation to what Nathan said, and how we talk about these issues with folks who are going to feel that we are threatening their worldview and their sense of self. And essentially the answer is find someone in their tribe to have this conversation with them. So what that means for me is I have to shut up. I have to not talk. I'm not going to be able to convince them. But you find someone in their tribe who is going to be able to talk with them, right? I think this is also really valuable for the church, because essentially, as people of faith, that is our tribe. Other people of faith. Our individual congregations are our tribes. Right? And so we can speak to one another from that perspective. So what the researchers go on to say is that these best effective strategies are using culturally diverse communicators whose affinity with different communities enhances their credibility, and information framing techniques that invest policy solutions with resonances to these diverse groups. So perfecting such techniques through a new science of science communication is really important. So basically what it's saying is science doesn't have these communication techniques, right? And we can wait until the cows come home for science to perfect its science communication techniques. But this, for me, so instead of getting discouraged about this, what this says, though, is that as people of faith in our houses of worship, in our faith communities, we have already some of this language and some of these communication tools, some of these communication techniques that will allow us to reach people. And some of that's what we've been trying to model here. The very first activity we did with making our own creation, right? The water cycle that we did with the Psalms, the setting up of our altar, the use of ritual here. Those are, if we did a remembering our baptism, I thought about having us close by remembering our baptism. Those are all rituals that we can use that speak far more to people than the science part of it. Right? And because we're in each other's tribe, then we have a sort of street cred with one another that we wouldn't have. Now, are there sub-tribes within our tribes? Absolutely. And are you going to have to go outside of your tribe and find communicators to be in your tribe with you? Absolutely. And so that's sort of the short take-home message.
Well, being a science teacher, this threatens my worldview.
This blew up my worldview.
I know.
Blew it up.
Because my idea has always been, where's the data? Let's look at the data. And actually what I have done since last July is I've been watching, when I watch the news at night, the national news, I've been jotting down the number of times natural disasters have been mentioned, and I've got this many pages.
All right, but I'm going to stop you right there. What news are you watching? Because where are your news? You don't have to answer that question out loud.
You're right, and I understand
right?
the question.
But starting from the very place where you get your news source from informs how many times that's going to get reported on and how many times you're going to write that down.
I
We were
understand.
having the same discussion in plenary just now, where we were talking about when we did our group study, and one of the ladies at the table said, everybody knows climate change, everybody knows it's true, and you just present the information and da-da-da-da. And I said, it doesn't work like that, because you coming out of a place where you believe, this is what you believe are the facts. And this is emotional.
The premise starts with you believe this, and then you go find the facts to support that belief. It is not that you have facts, and that facts informs a belief.
Informs the belief. And looking at a good book on how to deal with people and they're making decisions is called Switch. Switch is making change happen when change is uncomfortable. And it talks about the elephant and the rider.
Yeah.
The elephant and the rider, and so the rider is the reasonable, logical person, and the elephant is the emotive. And unless you appeal to both, people will not move from where they are. And just going back to the other thing where they said no one was going to Jesus through an argument.
Right.
Never win people to this with an argument.
Right. That's an excellent point. We don't need to use climate change as the example. Religion, right, is the ultimate. Right? You're not going to bring people to religion. You're not going to bring people to faith through an argument, through charts and graphs and data.
I was at a table also with people who were not my tribe. And I said, I don't even talk about climate change when I go and present to groups. In fact, I tell them up front, we're not going to talk about climate change because it shuts people down. And she looked at me and she's like, really? Like, she couldn't fathom that. I'm like, there are plenty of people in our church, in our UMC tribe, you cannot say climate change to without them shutting down. Mm-hmm. So, and for those of us who are facilitators in certain parts of the country, I think setting expectations that you're not going to talk about climate change actually opens the door for you.
Right. And so, you either go in through a different door, or you find a different storyteller. You find someone from a tribe that person is also a member of, and have that person talk about climate change. Right? Right. I'll just briefly touch on this. There's a trailer that goes along with it, but since you'll get this PowerPoint, you can go and look at the trailer, and you can even get this movie, because to me this connects with this. This movie is based on this woman's doctoral dissertation. She's from the University of Wisconsin, I think. But her premise was that faith-based problems need faith-based solutions. It's based on a small island off the eastern shore of Virginia called Smith Island. Mm-hmm. And for centuries, the watermen there have been making their living from catching blue crabs and oysters. And if you know anything about the Chesapeake Bay, the blue crab and oyster populations are declining precipitously. And so there's this constant struggle with the watermen, with their livelihood and their way of life and their worldview, and environmentalists who are saying that stop catching blue crabs and oysters, or at least you need to dramatically reduce how much you're catching, or you can only catch by certain sizes. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is one of the largest environmental groups in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, had an office on Smith Island, and I say had, because at the height of the tension between CBF and state regulators and the watermen over proposed new regulations on blue crab harvest, that office got burned down, and it was deemed to be arson, but they couldn't figure out who set it on fire and burned it down. It was at this time that Susan Emmerlich came in, and with this idea that faith-based problems need faith-based solutions, and that it wasn't an environmental issue going on here, it wasn't a scientific issue going on here, it was a faith issue. And when she met with the watermen and talked with them about how this was their way of life, and this was their livelihood, and this was their worldview, and they didn't need scientists and environmentalists coming in to tell them that they ought to care about creation, they were on creation every day, so they knew more about creation than any scientist did. She realized there was something there to tap into, and when she talked with their wives, and the wives would say, we're concerned. It was the woman from the island in the Marshall Islands, right? She would say, where are we going to live, and what are we going to do? These women said the same thing. But she realizes that they all had a deep and profound respect and awe of creation, and that came from their faith. Mm-hmm. And so they invited her into the church, and they did Bible studies about Genesis 1 and 2 and what it means to be created in God's image and what dominion means. And the watermen came to see that this is our worldview, caring for creation. And our faith tells us that we are to be good stewards. And so if we can have a seat at the table with the state regulators and have a voice in setting those blue crab harvest limits, then we will agree to abide by them. And they did that, and then in church, during worship one Sunday, they signed a covenant saying, I will only catch X amount of blue crabs of X amount size, and then laid that on the altar. And then they had flags made, and each waterman who signed that covenant put a flag on his boat, and every other waterman would know that because he had that flag, he had signed this covenant, and they would watch other watermen and hold them accountable to being in this covenant together. completely shifted the conversation, completely reframed the conversation, right? All starting from the premise that faith-based problems have faith-based solutions. If we start from the premise that climate justice is a faith-based problem, if climate injustice is a faith-based problem, it requires a faith-based solution. Right? And that we, as the community of faith, are about coming up with that solution and holding each other, signing that covenant, being in that covenant, and then holding each other mutually accountable. So there's a lot of really great lessons, I think, from that we can take into this conversation about climate change and about climate justice.
Okay, so this is the documentary that talks about all that, the heaven and earth.
Yes, When Heaven Meets Earth. Right, and you can get a copy of the movie, and there's all kinds of study guides and leader discussions that can come along with it. So it's something that you could show. What also ends up happening in that film is that the watermen talk about that they are downstream from their upstream neighbors, who are the farmers in Pennsylvania, and what fertilizer and what pesticides the farmers upstream put on their farm ends up washing downstream and affecting the blue crab and oyster population.